Imagine this: a peaceful summer barbecue, families laughing, kids playing, and the mouth-watering smell of ribs floating across a quiet neighborhood until one bitter neighbor decides joy itself is a crime. She doesn't just complain, she calls the cops over barbecue smoke. But what starts as her petty attempt to ruin one family's day spirals into the most outrageous neighborhood rebellion you'll ever hear. Because instead of ending the party, her complaint sparks a street-wide cookout that turns the entire block against her, leaving her furious, humiliated, and trapped in her own house while the smell of victory and ribs fills the air. What began with one sizzling grill soon becomes the unforgettable moment she wished she'd never started. It all started on what seemed like the perfect summer afternoon. The sun was shining, kids were riding bikes down tree-lined streets, and the subtle clink of lawn sprinklers created a soundtrack for a suburban paradise. In one particular yard, the Johnson family had fired up their grill. The scent of sizzling ribs and marinated chicken floated through the breeze, wafting across the cul-de-sac like an invitation. Neighbors walking dogs smiled as they tasked, secretly hoping to be offered a plate once the cooking was done. It was one of those days where life felt pleasantly simple. Unfortunately, simplicity never lasts long in a neighborhood with a self-proclaimed enforcer of rules. Just a few houses down lived Karen, the neighbor who treated property guidelines and unwritten suburban etiquette like the supreme laws of the land. She wasn't officially part of the HOA, but she acted as if she ruled it. Karen's eyes frequently darted from her curtains whenever someone dared mow their yard a little too early or left trash cans out a shade longer than she considered acceptable. As the smoky aroma of barbecue spread down the block, Karen felt her blood pressure spike. The Johnson family's backyard grill, in her eyes, wasn't a simple expression of summer joy, but an attack on her personal comfort. She slammed shut her windows, but still smelled the faint trace of ribs cooking in her backyard fantasy of rule enforcement. To her, it wasn't food, it was a violation. Her frustration snowballed into outrage. She convinced herself that the smoke was polluting the air, that she couldn't breathe properly, and that her property value was plummeting with each waft of hickory smoke leaving the Johnson grill. In most neighborhoods, this might have been handled with a polite comment, or even just ignoring it. But this wasn't most neighborhoods, and this wasn't most neighbors. This was Karen. So she did the one thing she believed would cement her authority. She picked up her phone, dialed the non-emergency line, and filed a complaint. She described hazardous smoke, exaggerated the situation dramatically, and implied she was living under siege by barbecue enthusiasts. For good measure, she even hinted at potential health violations, ensuring the dispatcher logged the complaint. The Johnsons, still flipping burgers and laughing with their kids, had no idea that trouble was brewing just a few doors down. For them, it was just a Saturday afternoon, their turn to host life's small joys in the form of food shared around a grill. They couldn't suspect that someone in the neighborhood was already plotting to ruin the gathering. As the sizzling intensified and neighbors wandered closer with curious looks, Karen stood in her kitchen smugly, convinced the authorities would soon descend on the party and put an end to what she saw as a culinary crime scene. She straightened her posture and envisioned the moment she could stand outside with a knowing smirk, claiming she had restored order to her street. She didn't know it yet, but her phone call had unintentionally lit a match far greater than any barbecue flame. What began as one family enjoying grilled ribs would soon spiral into a conflict involving the entire neighborhood, the police officers she counted on to support her, and most of all, her rapidly deteriorating reputation as the self-appointed guardian of suburban life. The stage was set for a clash between summer joy and controlling spite, and the neighborhood was about to find out which side it truly was on. The Johnsons flipped ribs with the rhythm of summer, while kids chased bubbles in the yard, completely unaware that their barbecue had just been labeled a toxic hazard by the neighborhood's most notorious watchdog. Down the street, Karen hovered by her front door like a queen awaiting her guards. She had her arms folded, a grin stretched across her face, already picturing the Johnsons scrambling as the smell of hickory and spice was treated like contraband. Within minutes, headlights pierced the calm suburban street. A patrol car rolled slowly up the cul-de-sac, its presence completely out of place among toy bicycles and garden hoses. Karen's heart raced with triumph. She darted out onto her lawn like she owned the entire moment, waving and pointing dramatically toward the Johnsons' backyard as if unveiling evidence to investigators. To her, this was glory. The troublemakers would be exposed and her self-imposed order restored. But the reality of the situation hit differently the moment officers stepped out. Instead of rushing in with urgency, they paused, nostrils catching the delicious aroma breezing through the neighborhood. Instead of alarms, they were greeted by the sight of kids laughing, neighbors chatting, and a family carefully tending burgers and ribs. The so-called toxic hazard wasn't filling the air like wildfire, it was simply the smell of dinner. The Johnsons were startled, frozen in confusion as officers explained they'd been called over smoke complaints. Their heads tilted, glances exchanged, as disbelief washed over them like a sudden summer rainstorm.
The neighbors surrounding the yard quickly caught on. This wasn't a real crime. This was Karen. Once again, she had escalated something ordinary into a headline moment only she believed mattered. Karen, however, stood at the front, practically bouncing on her heels. She expected citations, fines, maybe even the grill being shut down. What she hadn't prepared for was the slow unfolding of reality. Officers calmly explaining that barbecuing on private property was entirely legal and the so-called smoke hazard was nothing more than the byproduct of dinner. Her triumphant smirk began to shrivel, but instead of retreating, she doubled down. She waved her arms dramatically, insisting that the smoke was choking her and ruining her day. Neighbors quietly whispered, some rolling their eyes, others laughing into their cups. The officers' patience became thinner with each exaggerated claim, their folded notepads remaining suspiciously blank. Meanwhile, more neighbors strolled out of their houses, drawn in by the flashing lights and curious chatter. What began as one family's barbecue was turning into a neighborhood spectacle. People leaned on fences, arms crossed, waiting to see if the Johnsons' grill would be shut down or if Karen's complaints would collapse into yet another public embarrassment. For the police, the decision was already clear. It wasn't the Johnsons that needed scolding. It was someone else entirely. The only scene unfolding wasn't dangerous, it was Karen's public performance unraveling in real time. But the neighborhood wasn't done watching and waiting. If the officers weren't going to make this a big deal, perhaps the community would. And as Karen's temper boiled hotter than the Johnsons' sizzling barbecue pit, an idea was quietly forming among the neighbors nearby. This wasn't just about one backyard grill anymore. This was about making a statement about joy, unity, and perhaps a little bit of well-deserved humiliation. As the officers wrapped up their visit with a light shrug, telling the Johnsons they were free to enjoy their cookout, Karen's smug expression crumbled into outrage, but the scene left the neighbors buzzing with a new idea. They realized this wasn't just about one family's barbecue anymore. It was about standing up to the tyranny of one person who had turned community life into her personal crusade. And that realization traveled faster than the smoky scent drifting through the street. Whisper by whisper, laugh by laugh, they started to hatch a subtle but powerful plan. If smoke from one grill had Karen so furious, what would she do if every single house on the street wheeled out their grills at the same time? It was the ultimate recipe for poetic justice, a way to turn her petty phone call into the spark of the biggest neighborhood party ever seen. Nobody said it out loud in front of Karen, but once she stomped back into her house, slamming her front door hard enough to rattle windows, that was the moment the plan fully crystallized. People who barely spoke more than a wave before were now exchanging knowing glances, sharing quick winks and nods, passing around the electric current of mischief that tied them together against their common adversary. Excitement rolled through the cul-de-sac like thunder before a storm, and as grills were dragged from garages, meats and vegetables pulled from freezers and folding tables dusted off, a secret rebellion took shape, an uprising powered not by anger, but laughter, curiosity, and a hunger to flip Karen's sourness into a delicious victory. What started as a tense interruption soon felt like a brewing festival, one where everyone had a role to play. And while Karen had envisioned police sirens being her trophy, she had no idea that her complaint had instead opened the door to the biggest and smokiest block party the street had ever witnessed. By the time the sun began leaning toward the horizon, the neighborhood had silently transformed into something extraordinary, a rebellion disguised as a celebration. As one by one, grills sparked to life, popping and hissing in unison, sending up smoky ribbons into the sky like battle flags, waving proudly against Karen's dictatorship. The street smelled like a carnival, a mixture of ribs slathered with sticky sauce, sizzling burgers dripping juice onto coals, corn charring to golden perfection. And every household contributed something: coolers filled with soda, trays of brownies, giant speakers that pumped music through the cul-de-sac like a heartbeat of defiance. Kids darted across the asphalt with water balloons, dogs wagged excitedly at fallen scraps of food, and parents laughed with a carefree energy that made the atmosphere electric. While at the center of it all lay the knowledge that this wasn't just a spontaneous cookout, it was a united stand sparked by one bitter complaint. Hidden behind her curtains, Karen stared through the blinds, her face tightening with every plume of smoke that rose into the air, her frustration bubbling into rage because, instead of cowering or apologizing, her neighbors had doubled, tripled, multiplied the very thing she wanted to erase. And the more she fumed, the louder the music grew, the stronger the laughter rang out, until her whole illusion of control cracked under the joyful chaos taking over the street.
Police cars that had left barely an hour ago circled back out of mere curiosity, not because of her new frantic calls, but just to see the scene unfolding. When the officers stepped out again, they didn't move with urgency or reprimand. They smiled, joked with neighbors, and even accepted a plate of food, proving to everyone that Karen's crusade had officially backfired beyond repair. The street had never felt so alive, so bonded, and as sunset created a fiery glow over the rooftops, it was clear that what Karen had intended as a punishment had ignited the biggest neighborhood party of the year, leaving her trapped in her own living room, powerless, watching as joy conquered her bitterness. As the music thumped louder and the smoke from 20 grills rose like a victory banner over the cul-de-sac, the pressure inside Karen's house finally snapped, and with the force of an erupting volcano, she flung her door open and stormed out, marching down her driveway like an army of one facing an entire festival. Her arms flailed, her face flushed a furious shade of red, and her voice carried over the beat of the speakers as she screamed about violations, safety hazards, and imaginary ordinances no one had ever heard of. But instead of fear or silence, her tantrum only fueled the laughter and cheers, neighbors raising their sodas and mock toasts, while kids clapped like they were watching a circus performance. Every step she took made her look less like an authority figure and more like the evening's main attraction. And when she stormed up to the officers who were casually eating ribs, demanding they shut everything down, the timing couldn't have been worse, because sauce still glistened on their hands and smiles were still fresh on their faces, making her rant look absurd in comparison to the relaxed joy around her. The louder she screamed, the more the neighborhood seemed to unite in spirit, neighbors turning up the music, flipping burgers theatrically, passing plates to the officers, and treating the whole meltdown like live entertainment. Cameras clicked, phones recorded, and within seconds, her outburst had transformed into viral content in the making, neighbors capturing the spectacle of Karen shrieking against the backdrop of a joyous block party. The very smoke she despised now became her stage lighting, swirling dramatically around her as if the universe itself mocked her outrage. And even she realized that instead of silencing the fun, her tantrum had only cemented the event as unforgettable. The block was no longer just having fun, it was celebrating her downfall, while she stood caught in the spotlight, unable to escape the humiliation she had created with her own bitterness. When the last streaks of sunset faded into the night sky, the cul-de-sac glowed brighter than a festival. Fairy lights strung across porches, grills still sputtering with late-night skewers, laughter rolling like thunder, and music pulsating in a rhythm that made everyone feel alive. And right at the center of it all stood the undeniable truth: Karen had lost. Not because the police dismissed her complaints, not even because her tantrum had become the evening's entertainment, but because in her desperation to tear down one family's happiness, she had accidentally built an empire of unity she could never undo. Parents who had never spoken beyond a wave were now swapping recipes and trading phone numbers for future get-togethers. Kids ran in packs from one yard to another, and neighbors who once kept to themselves realized how much stronger, happier, and freer life felt when they stood together against unnecessary control. The officers eventually left, still laughing with their take-home barbecue plates, shaking their heads at how a petty call had turned into one of the liveliest community events they'd ever witnessed. And as their cruisers disappeared down the street, the sense of triumph among the neighbors only grew stronger. Karen, however, retreated into her darkened house, blinds slammed shut, her shouts having dissolved into silence, leaving her isolated while outside, the party raged stronger than ever, a living symbol of her defeat. The smell of ribs and burgers lingered like sweet revenge, and every puff of smoke into the night sky became a reminder that joy will always burn brighter than bitterness. By the time the last grill cooled and people hugged one another goodbye, plans were already being made. This wasn't the Karen barbecue incident anymore, it was officially the first annual block party, a tradition born from one person's spite, but nurtured by dozens of families' laughter. And so, with full bellies, sore cheeks from laughing, and phones full of videos that would later go viral online, the neighborhood knew they had won something far more important than just a single battle. They had found unity, friendship, and the priceless satisfaction of turning Karen's bitterness into their everlasting joy.